So we're still on the general topic of international experience and lessons for New Zealand. Our next speaker has come to us all the way from Canada, where Dwayne Winseck is Professor at the School of Journalism and Communication with a cross-appointment to the Institute of Political Economy, which are both at Carleton University, Ottawa. I'm really keen to have somebody who's actually coming from an Institute of Political Economy. We can have a conversation later about whether it's real political economy or just called political economy, but that's for another time. The really good news is that Dwayne's actually done a bit of bespoke research for us. His focus here today is on consumer segment issues, and his objective is to compare and contrast segment issues in New Zealand with those in other comparable countries, such as Canada. I would suggest that somebody who's written a book called Communication and Empire, Media, Markets and Globalization is an ideal person to speak about that to us. So could I please ask you to welcome Dwayne to the microphone.
Thank you very much for the introduction, David, and thank you very much to the Competition Commission for inviting me here, especially Sylvia Zanini and her team. They've done an incredible amount of work to make this happen for me, and I really appreciate that. And thanks a lot for everybody else showing up here. So what I'm going to do here today is I'm going to examine the development of what I call the telecom media internet, or the TMI, industries here in New Zealand, and the prospects for the ultra-fast broadband initiative. And I'm going to compare conditions with the experiences of Canada, the US, and several OECD countries. My focus is going to be on competition, open networks, and access to content rights for traditional and online media. And I'm going to look in particular at two recent cases that I think are quite instructive from the US and from Canada. The first is going to be Comcast's takeover of NBC Universal in 2011 and the FCC's new Comcast rules, and the Canadian regulators' response to the rise of 4 large vertically integrated TMI conglomerates in Canada. I'll call those the Canadian rules. All along the way, I'm going to be consistently looking at New Zealand's changing rank in the OECD league tables over time. The good news is, one, I think we can see some improvement in the levels of telecoms competition and development here in New Zealand, particularly in the last 5 years. I think we can also see an improved regulatory environment. I also think, and this is following on with some things that Gerd spoke about this morning, and Robert in particular, that we're seeing the rise of what I'd like to call the primetime internet, which is really driven by online video and entertainment that is much more diverse, open, and user-driven than it's been in the past, and that this is going to be a very key demand driver. But I think there's also 5 things that we have to pay attention to, 5 things that could be demand stiflers, if you will. The first of these is the high level of media concentration here in New Zealand. Second, restrictive bandwidth caps. Third, low media and internet use generally amongst New Zealanders. Fourth, a regulator that I don't think is yet fully entrenched or quite appreciated as being an essential element in a competitive, open, and pluralistic media environment. And fifth, entrenched and powerful incumbents. One of the things that I want to really focus on here is this idea of open networks. This idea of open networks is not new. We can trace it back to Roman roads and Venetian canals. We can trace it back to the development of universal postal systems. Excuse me, I'm falling behind here a little bit on my things already. To universal postal systems that serve as a common network to deliver news, mail, and knowledge to every person's doorstep, affordably and according to strict standards of privacy. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the UK, the US, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada all tackled what they called the rise of double-headed news monopolies being formed by telegraph companies and news agencies. When we came into the 20th century, what did we find? We found that telecom players were playing a very large role in radio and in the film industries. AT&T in particular was a large player in Hollywood and in the radio industry until being forced out of the film industry under threat of antitrust intervention, and it left the radio industry through a series of corporate agreements. There's a complex history in that long list of examples that I just gave you, but there's a very simple principle, and the simple principle is that control over distribution technology should not be permitted to shape ancillary media and content markets. So, whoops. There we go. What I want to talk about here now is kind of model that we saw emerging in the late 1990s, early 2000s in North America. I call it the all pipes open model, and its shift over time towards a more closed model. During New Zealand's kind of unfortunate experiment, as one of your local authors refers to it in the 1990s with free market fantasies, the rest of the world was moving in an opposite direction and actually developing regulators as a fundamental attribute of opening up markets. And so what we saw was a radical expansion of regulatory frameworks over time. In 1990, there were only 14 telecom and media regulators worldwide. Today, there are 155. Open markets are not equal to deregulation, but rather good regulation. US and Canada were leaders in fostering competition and open network policies, and they were focused on promoting competition between incumbent telephone and cable companies with the lure of open access to bring in new service providers. The CRTC used open access rules for telecom and cable companies, plus non-exclusivity rules for content, and saw these as being absolutely essential for competition and for developing pluralism in the broadcasting and media environment as a whole. Similar methods were also used in the US, and both countries thought that access to marquee content would be essential if you were going to have broadband development and competition in the marketplace amongst broadband providers. The US implemented the competition and open access rules, most notably with the Telecommunications Act of 1996, while, as Robert Pepper noted this morning, it was the cities, 30,000 of them across the US, that were responsible for cable franchises that implemented open access to the cable infrastructure in the US. The benefits, I think, were very fast and very clear. So in Canada, by the end of the 1990s, we had 950 ISPs, the second highest broadband penetration in the world. The US was doing quite well with 8th ranking in broadband connections in 2002, and competition was very high by current standards. Of course, not everybody liked the open access pro-competition rules. The cable companies in particular chafed at the open access rules, and here's a great quote that I've always liked from AT&T that expressed their view quite well of these open access rules. We didn't spend $56 billion to get into the cable and subscription television business just to have the blood sucked out of our veins. The cable companies also went to the courts against the open access rule, arguing that open access rules were a violation of their First Amendment free speech rights. AOL, as well, had been a huge proponent of open access rules in the 1990s, imported the Canadian rules and thought they were so good into the US and was pushing those very hard city by city and chalking up a number of wins. But as soon as it merged with Time Warner in 2000, it abandoned these open access rules, right? So by the end of the 1990s, kind of turn of the 21st century, convergence goes global, and the idea of walled gardens becomes all the rage. In Canada, we had two of our largest telecom providers become telecom media internet companies, Bell and Quebecor, as they took over the largest television networks as well as the largest newspaper chains. So here we had these fully integrated media conglomerates that were emerging at the turn of the 20th century, looking at the AOL Time Warner model of convergence as a model that they wanted to emulate, and this was kind of exported around the world. The turn of the 21st century was kind of the high tide of vertical integration, convergence, and so on, and it was also the birth of what I'll call the walled garden. It led one analyst, telecom economist Peter Kerwin, to say, the age or the era of comms dinosaurs bestriding the world is upon us, and the days of open access were therefore numbered. The internet was also being changed at this particular point in time. All right, the early internet was defined by innovation in a very diverse marketplace. The next phase of telecom and media conglomerates sought to build a new and different kind of internet, not one that was open, decentralized, with all the intelligence and capability spread out to the edge of the network, but rather one that was organized around sticky portholes. And this quote here from Elizabeth Vancouver, I think sums it up very well. Here's a model, or a diagram of the walled garden model. And here we can see the ISP right down at the bottom there. And the whole function of the ISP is to basically bring people into the walled garden and to keep them there. A very different model than the search and social-led model that the internet has come now. The full function of search is to get people out into the internet and to range across the internet as much as possible. It's not to try to keep people inside of walled gardens and so on and so forth. All right? Now, as the walled gardens became the new Valhalla, the cable and telecom giants became ever more intent on thwarting open access principles. Now the FCC's every move in this direction was intercepted by the incumbents' claims that their business models were inviolable, and by hefty or extensive litigation and lobbying all along the way. By 2002, the open access and unbundling rules that had characterized the late 1990s and the early development of the internet had really been gutted, and competition limited now to two pipes into the home, the telephone company's pipes and that of the cable company's pipes. And whilst the companies themselves were pursuing a new model, we saw the technology also being re-geared around the walled garden model. And I think these quotes from Cisco that were handed out at a convention during a time really reflect the change away from this kind of open internet, which kind of encourages people to wander and to discover information with the age of search functionality and social networking and so on, to a walled garden model in which the technology itself takes over a kind of a regulatory function. All right? And so I think this is really important, because what it shows us is that technologies are not neutral. Technologies are bent to serve the purposes of those who use them. And in this case, it was the incumbents who were intent on building these walled garden models. And these weren't just kind of hypothetical ideas here. These were plans and networks that are actually designed by Cisco and put into place by most of the world's leading telecom and cable providers, such as AOL, Time Warner, AT&T, Bell Canada, Cable Wireless, Rogers, and so on and so forth. The key idea here is that we had control and regulatory capabilities actually being welded right into the networks themselves. So, once you had this, the idea now was not just that this was an open internet in which people would freely explore, but rather that the internet was something that the companies themselves would regulate. And you can see this if you read their acceptable use policies. And I've taken out a couple of the key features in one of the acceptable use policies of the cable companies here. Thou shalt not download more than 10 minutes of streaming video per day, or send bulk emails, or operate a news service. And the list went on and on and on. And so as the incumbents consolidated their position, the wreckage, as I called it, piled up. Competition amongst ISPs was massively reduced. The main pillars of the open networks, common carriage, line of business restrictions, and structural separation, were gutted. Telephone and cable company competition became the new norm. Many incumbents failed. The walled garden model ended up turning to be a disaster. As the Benkler study concluded, markets that rely on just two competitors, the telephone companies and cable companies in the North American case, have not fared well at all. They offer the lowest speeds at the highest prices. All right? Okay, so as the incumbents consolidated their position, they came up with a number of new tools to help maintain that position, three of which stand out: bandwidth caps, network throttling, and vertical integration, or the walled garden model that I suggested. Right? So bandwidth caps. Bandwidth caps, broadband internet development in Canada and the US is very, very similar. But one of the things that they differ on greatly is that bandwidth caps are used much more extensively and at much lower levels in Canada than they are in the US. In the US, they are either non-existent or set at very high levels, around 250 gigabits per month or more. All right? Canada joins just 3 other countries, 3 other OECD countries, that is, where bandwidth caps are both universal and low. Australia, New Zealand, Iceland. All right? And here's the kind of little comparative model I've tried to give you here, so we can get an example here by just looking across the various service levels. And I think for you folks here, you probably want to take a look at the situation here in New Zealand. I think on each one of the measures here, except for the low end, you come up rather low on the bandwidth caps. Price looks rather high, all right? And that's something to keep in mind. Right. So Canada's biggest ISP, Bell, was the first to introduce bandwidth caps. It did so in 2006 after offering unlimited plans for 8 years. In 2007, after a year of having introduced the bandwidth caps, it basically made those universal and no longer offered the unlimited plan whatsoever. And what I think is really important to take note of is that once Bell put these into place, the rest of the major ISPs kind of fell into line, because in concentrated markets, that's what dominant players do. They move in flocks. So bandwidth caps have served not just to discipline so-called excessive users, but as a legacy business model protection plan for the telephone and cable companies, which in Canada are also the biggest ISPs and broadcasters. US and Canadian broadcasters, I think it's important to note, have been really slow to put their programming up online, moving to do so only in 2006 and 2008, respectively. Still, in Canada and in the US, watching television online is at a relatively low level of around 3 to 5%. However, real-time entertainment video online has exploded, as was made clear this morning. And here's a graph showing the trends in North America. All right. So even on mobile networks, we're seeing real-time entertainment is now accounting for up to a third of bandwidth during peak time, followed by web browsing and social networking. Key point here is online video is a major use of the internet, and it's likely to be a driver of broadband, of superfast broadband here in New Zealand. Canadians are amongst the heaviest users of the internet in the world, with an average internet user spending over 46 hours per month online, compared to 34 hours in the US and 21 in New Zealand. They are avid online viewers as well, viewing on average about 185 online videos per month, compared to the high end of the scale, 196 in the US, compared to the low end of the scale, which is in New Zealand, at around 71 online videos per month. These trends have not cut into TV viewing, though, or broadcasters' revenues. But what they have done is brought a number of very large, powerful global players to the broadcasters' doorsteps, players like Google, YouTube, Netflix, Apple, and so on. And traditional broadcasters are fighting this incursion of new online video distributors tooth and nail, and bandwidth caps serve in this battle as a key weapon in their arsenal. Bandwidth caps and usage-based billings deter rival online video distributors by making it much more expensive to download TV program and films from entities such as Netflix, while similar services offered by the incumbents are excluded from the bandwidth caps and excess usage charges. Netflix in Canada actually had to deliberately degrade the quality of its service in order to help subscribers avoid hitting the bandwidth caps. It's not often that you want to compete in a market where you have to deliberately degrade your service in order to compete. In addition to bandwidth caps, there's another practice that's very prevalent in North America, but not so prevalent here in New Zealand. And that practice is a practice of throttling. So So here's a chart from MNet. It's a Google-sponsored project. And if you look at the key things to look at right here are, in a number of tests that they do, looking for throttling, they found that 87% of the tests that they did in Canada for throttling of peer-to-peer information flows came up as being throttled. We had 60 in the US, but look down here at New Zealand. New Zealand fares quite well, actually, on the network throttling measures. So I think that's something that is worthwhile to keep in mind here as well, especially if we think that the idea of networks is to facilitate the flow of information as opposed to performing as gatekeepers over the flow of information. A third form of strategic behavior besides bandwidth caps and network throttling is vertical integration. All right, it derives it's as a general proposition, vertical integration is on the wane around the world, primarily because it's been a failed business model. With many of the companies that embraced it having failed spectacular. I think the poster child for the failed vertically integrated company is AOL Time Warner, which successfully wiped out about $250 billion worth of market cap over 9 years. There's a long list of others that kind of sit in that illustrious group of companies that went on the walled garden vertical integration path at the turn of the century and just blew apart their balance sheets. In addition to AOL Time Warner, we can point to we can point to AT&T. We can point to the bankruptcy of Can West, which I'm sorry left you with a bit of an enfeebled and somewhat problem. MediaWorks still kind of laboring with the aftermath of that. Bertelsmann, News Corp, Viacom, CBS, Time Warner have all begun to break themselves up, spin off units, and breaking apart this idea of the massive media conglomerate. So the days of the media conglomerates are numbered. And I also think we can say that the idea of the walled garden appears to be on the wane because end users want to be able to get their applications from the internet rather than have their access provider or communications network provider select them for them. All right? So the decline of vertical integration, though, means that that conflict in the markets for programming rights have become a lot more important, and the conflict within programming markets a lot more intense. Established broadcasters are pushing very hard to compete, to avoid competing for content rights with new players such as Netflix, Apple TV, and Google by keeping them out of the online market altogether, or by simply trying to fold online programming rights into the traditional bundle of rights that they've acquired. That, of course, is not how most rights holders see things or how new players on the block see things. Now, so with the demise of vertical integration, intensifying conflict over content rights, we've had these skirmishes breaking out around the world, one country after another, seeing this intense kind of conflict emerging over content rights. What's the position of online media rights within the overall media ecology? All right. But while I've said that vertical integration in general has been on the wane, we can see two really important exceptions to this. The two important exceptions are, one, the Comcast takeover of NBC Universal, which is the largest broadcaster and film studio in the United States. That was done last year. And in Canada, we saw the takeover of the two largest broadcasters by the two largest telecom and cable companies in the same year. The Canadian case really cuts against the grain of trends worldwide in that most of our providers are vertically integrated, what I call TMI conglomerates. They're in telecoms, they're in media, and they're in internet. We have four major providers. I call them the Big Four. Now, what I think is really quite interesting is the way the FCC responded to the Comcast acquisition of NBC Universal. They asked three questions as they started their review of this takeover. And they were concerned with Comcast's ability to use their control over video programming to harm competing multi-video programming distributors, what you would call here as subscription pay TV providers. Second, use of control over video programming, broadband, or set-top boxes to harm current or emerging online rivals. And third, to deny unaffiliated video programmers access to Comcast subscribers or impose unreasonable terms for distribution. On each point, the FCC said that the potential for harm was substantial. All right? And feeling that the potential for harm was substantial, it set up a number of rules. These were the rules that Comcast basically had to accept in order for the merger to be approved. I think they're very relevant to the situation that we have here in New Zealand, right? So they had to offer, Comcast must offer TV and film content to online video distributors. It had to adopt the FCC's open internet principles. It had to treat affiliated network traffic the same as unaffiliated network traffic when it comes to bandwidth caps, tiers, metering, or any other kind of usage-based billing. Couldn't prioritize affiliated internet content, and so on and so forth. You can read down the rest of the list on your own, right? What was also interesting is that the FCC said that its decision and the Comcast rules that it designed were essential to promoting a robust online video distribution market that would encourage broadband adoption, consistent with the goals of the Commission's National Broadband Plan. Okay, let's move ahead now to the CRTC. The CRTC, like the FCC, also has a great deal of power under the two major pieces of legislation, the Telecommunications Act and the Broadcasting Act, that prevent undue preference, self-dealing with respect to programming rights. It has used these rules to ensure that a lack of content does not hobble new rivals, technologies, and services. And it's used these over the course of, say, 40 to 50 years since the development of cable, satellite distribution, and pay TV, video on demand, and now new media services in a converged media environment. Canada's Comcast moment came in 2011 during the CRTC's hearings on vertical integration in the TMI industries. The big four vertically integrated media companies, Bell, Rogers, Shaw, and Quebecor, said, well, look, there's no problem here whatsoever. Everybody move along, go home, nothing to see. Everybody else, though, said there is a significant problem. So the CRTC responded by introducing a series of measures designed to offset the vertically integrated company's capacity to use programming rights and network access to the detriment of competition and diversity. 5 things stick out. So the big four cannot offer TV programs exclusively to their own broadcast, internet, or mobile services and subscribers. They must offer it to rivals on commercial terms. Second, programs that they create specifically for the internet, those can be exclusive. Third, no blackouts during disputes over carriage and programming rights, as we've seen in the United States, where cable companies and the content companies are engaged in this kind of long-running skirmishes over the issue of rights. And what happens is cable companies either shut down the channel, or the content companies withdraw their content. And people's screens are basically left black. So this is the no blackout rule. The no block booking rule was basically a tied selling rule. You can't tie access to one channel to a whole bundle channel. You have to offer one channel at a time to other competitors in the market. And the one underneath that, of course, is for subscribers, all right? That you had to also allow subscribers to be able to pick and choose the channels that they wanted, as opposed to just being able to take the big tiers that the providers like to offer, all right? The CRTC decision, in my view, was a lot weaker than the FCC decision. The CRTC's decision, it sets up minimalist standards for program and network access, but it didn't do anything to establish the parity between the traditional media and the online media that the FCC decision did. I want to go on to what I call the Great Reversal. All right, Europe. I remember being at a meeting at Ofcom, or it was Oftel in those days, and BT was being told that it was going to have to unbundle its networks, and BT said that will never happen. This is around 1996, and they're very, very assertive about this. It's just, you know, if you can make pigs fly, perhaps we'll open up our networks. All right, so it was just a non-starter. All right. But already Canada and the US had been doing this for some time. And what we saw between kind of 96 and 2001 is we saw the North American model increasingly migrate to more OECD countries. We had early adopters, and we had what we can call the latecomers. Right. So, and then, of course, we have New Zealand here, what I call the free market fantasy years between 1989 and 2001, when the idea was that you didn't need to have any kind of regulatory regime set up just for the telecoms environment, that, you know, somehow you just let the market rip and everything else will take care of itself. Well, during the free market fantasy years, here's the kind of results that you got. Telecoms monopoly remained largely unscathed. You had a weak, basically no regulator until kind of 2001. Unbundling ideas, open access to networks. These were just kind of completely foreign ideas. The notion that you might have to think about convergent media and telecom industries and think about them in a unified way through unified policies and regulatory frameworks wasn't on the agenda. The results were pretty clear, I think. We had networks that were badly underdeveloped and overpriced. New Zealand as a whole, as I think most of us here know, was a bottom-of-the-pack performer in terms of broadband development. All right. So we can move now. We start to see things turning. The tide starts to turn slowly between 2001 and 2006. We get the light touch regulatory regime with the Telecommunications Act. Telecom's monopoly remains very strong, though. The regulator still isn't looking at open network and unbundling rules that are now well established, not just in North America, but also in many European and other OECD countries. We see the incursion of some new rivals like Vodafone that do reasonably well in mobile markets. Still, the idea of kind of a harmonized regulatory framework, a non-starter, and the key thing here is that we have anemic competition, broadband penetration rates that are still kind of at the very low end of the scale. Move ahead, breakthrough, right? This is kind of where we're at now in the last 5 years, as far as I can tell. So 2006 really seems to mark a turning point, functional separation for telecom, stronger powers given to the Telecommunications Commissioner, who starts to use them wisely. We get unbundled local loops and bitstream access adopted in 2006. Essential things to foster more competition. All right, and we get some successes. We get some broadband penetration per 100 increases. Competition starts to increase. Investment starts to increase, right? So open networks and a pro-competition regulatory framework actually work very well for what they're designed to do, right? Increase competition in the marketplace, increase investment by both the incumbent and by new players and so on. And then we get the big guns here at the end, the proposals for the ultra-fast broadband and the rural broadband initiatives, and of course, structural separation of telecom. And you look at a major study, the Berkman study that was put out in 2010, and starts to look at New Zealand with quite favorable eyes, you know, thinking that things have really turned a corner here. All right, so now, let's take a look here. This is from the Berkman study, all right? And so and this is based on 2008. So we got New Zealand kind of right there, 22nd. And basically we're using 3 measures here to assess the overall kind of levels and use of broadband networks within countries, all right? So the rankings, you know, it's still kind of low on the scale, all right? We've got 2 more years, though, since this 2008 data, and I was interested in seeing, you know, how have things gone in the last 2 years? Because the literature I was reading was suggesting, literature I was reading from New Zealand was suggesting that things have really turned around, that we're really now kind of moving ahead, and there's been a vast improvement. So what I did is I replicated the Berkman study, this table anyway, not the entire study, all right? And sorry, but things have gone down. Okay, I'm sorry to say this. I mean, it's not completely all in one direction. Here's what I found when we compare 2008 with 2010. In terms of penetration and speed, things have gone up fairly well. New Zealand has moved up the league tables from a score of 20 to 16 in terms of penetration, so greater access, well done, and from 17th to 15th on the question of speed. Not bad, all right? So the direction is good, and Dr. Pepper this morning also mentioned some positive directions. But if we look overall in terms of broadband development, we see that there's a decline relative to other countries, because guess what? New Zealand's not the only one that's running fast, right? All countries are running fast to develop their broadband networks. And so while developments have been to some degree impressive here, they are still, relatively speaking, against other countries, somewhat weak. All right. Now, when I'm, again, reading the literature here, trying to sort my way through the New Zealand kind of scene and make sense of it, I was reading some people saying, look, everything's pretty great here. The competition amongst ISPs is really, really hot. There's like 50 ISPs. Access to the market's good. The regulators, good. Any talk about open networks or net neutrality within this context is just really a non-starter. But that's really to kind of be looking through rose-tinted glasses, I think, because if we look at this here, this is basically a kind of a map of your telecom media internet environment, and looking at the market shares of the major players in each one. And what we need to look at here is the bottom numbers here, the CR4 numbers, and the better numbers, they're called HHI numbers. These are standard tools used to measure concentration. And what those numbers show is that every single one of your markets is highly concentrated, all right? And for ISPs in particular, the level of concentration is very high, with the big four accounting for over 80% of the markets. And ISPs in New Zealand, the independent ISPs, or the ISPs in general, have not thrived over the last decade, but really been left on a vine to wilt. There were 140 ISPs a decade ago, but through consolidation, there are now 60. All right, with four firms controlling over 80% of the market: Telecom, Vodafone, Telstra Clear, and Orcon. Okay, so New Zealand is not alone, though, on high levels of concentration. Here's a comparative look at things. And we can see that, New Zealand's right about here. All right, so we got France New Zealand's right there. And we've got France that's pretty close. All right, a group of countries up there that are kind of somewhat similar. The difference I see in New Zealand, though, is that it's a combination of high levels of concentration, consistently low rankings in the OECD tables, and uncertain willingness to deal with significant power. I mean, if we really want to look at a model of where we might want to be, we can take a look at Finland, all right? And it matters. Concentration at the level of ISPs matters because it means that the big four have enough clout to shape the broadband network media ecology, and that they tend to move in a flock on three key issues, as I hope to show in the last couple of minutes here. The three key issues being deep hearing, second, bandwidth caps, and third, by aligning themselves with Sky in ways that could turn their networks into mere reselling facilities rather than a basis from which to launch their own broadband, internet, telephone, and television services in competition with one another and against Sky. So let's take a look at the deep hearing story. I sussed out a lot of people before I came here, and I got to talk to some interesting people that are involved in various elements of your internet, media, and telecoms industry. And this is a story from one ISP here in New Zealand. As you can see, it's not a very happy story. Moving on to bandwidth caps. Again, there's a sense that comes out of the local literature, the New Zealand literature, that bandwidth caps, they're not such a big deal. They're not such a big problem. Besides, they work efficiently to discipline bandwidth hogs, those who use the internet excessively, so they're economically rational. And besides, the data caps in unmetered content has grown over the last couple of years, and so on. So things are getting better. All right. But if bandwidth caps were such a good thing, all the top performing countries would use them. They don't. As I said, there's only 4 of us: Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Iceland. All right? These are not desirable things. The problem with bandwidth caps is they're based on flawed economics. Low internet use is made worse. Bandwidth caps deter the development of online media services, and they're anti-competitive and discriminatory. In terms of the flawed economics, from an economic point of view, there's no link between charges and costs. The cost here for an excess gigabit, if you go over your allotted cap, is about $2. The cost of producing a gigabit is about 8 cents. All right? The cost here, the price to consumers now, is not a function of the underlying economics of production, but of the market structure, concentration. All right? So they also do something else. They also basically serve to deter investment in new capacity to meet demand. It's a very strange economy where you have excess demand, and what you do is you try to beat it down instead of trying to race after it and serve it. That's the way a normal market is supposed to work. Now, let's quickly move on here because I don't have a lot of time left. The low internet use is made worse. Internet use is strikingly low in New Zealand. Bandwidth caps do not encourage more use, but less. So average bandwidth used by subscribers in New Zealand is about 9 gigabits, according to the latest Statistics New Zealand numbers. In Canada, the number is 16 gigabits per subscriber, 17 in the UK, 23 in the US, and about 18 in the Asia-Pacific region as a whole. Now, here's going to be, ooh, that's really scary. Sorry, this is a big, scary thing. But just take a look at these bottom numbers here. New Zealand, and take a look at the average. What I'm trying to do here is show the low media use, okay, on a whole bunch of things. Basically, what we see on every single one of these is New Zealand is lower than the average, all right? So New Zealand's media use across a whole range of different media and internet uses comes up quite low. The only place where you rank higher than the average is on, where are we there? Facebook penetration. So it looks like you guys like to use Facebook quite a bit. A lot of people are Facebook users, but you don't spend as much time as everybody else does on Facebook. Right? So let's, again, quickly move on. If we accept that banning some excessive usage, some high excessive usage could be a good thing, the internet equipment manufacturer, Sandvine, suggests or imagines a scenario where users are allocated 200 gigabits per month for peak hour use and unlimited use thereafter. In this scenario, internet subscribers would get 10 to 40 times more bandwidth during just peak hours than New Zealanders get all month. All right? Bandwidth caps also work against this. We've talked about this a lot today. This is the rise of that real-time entertainment, the online video that we can see down here. All right? Bandwidth caps work very much against emerging uses, to work to dampen it down. They're completely out of sync with it. And of course, health, education services, e-commerce, online banking, and other serious uses are really important, especially in a government-driven project like the universal broadband or ultra-fast broadband initiative, right? But you know what? The real drivers, as it has always been for media in the past, are things that give people pleasure, all right? And so, watching video and playing games online, these days are going to be the real driver. Second thing here is bandwidth caps deter the development of online media services. Online media services like music downloading sites, online video, television, film, streaming, and rental stores, mobile TV, IPTV, They all rank low by international standards, European and North American ones in particular. That this is directly connected to the low bandwidth use is made time and time again by companies like Netflix, by companies like Apple, by commentators from Screen Digest. They always make these points. There seems to be very little argument amongst those who are trying to develop businesses, and I'm surprised that this is kind of an issue amongst certain commentators in New Zealand. Bandwidth caps, you can also argue, are anti-competitive and discriminatory because they are waived for the incumbents' own services and business partners, but applied to everyone else. In New Zealand and Australia, this is a unique practice that has emerged that you don't see anywhere else in the world. In Australia, for example, the commercial broadcaster Foxtel is exempt from bandwidth caps. Why? The only reason I can tell is because it's partially owned by Telstra. And the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the public service broadcaster, is not exempt from the bandwidth caps, but argues that all broadcasters should be. So we can see the anti-competitive practice here right away. There's a whole range of these kinds of agreements being set up now here in New Zealand. We've seen the migration, essentially, of a practice that started up in Australia migrate to New Zealand. So we see, for example, MediaWorks, television radio operations, Fairfax's Trade Me site, and the online gaming company Steam, all having unmetered access to the customers of Telstra's network. So that given that most unmetered sites are already major national, regional, and global media players, I would say that such practices reinforce the status quo, and they do very little to deal with or to help erode the high levels of media concentration. Now let's go to, here's the big one in the room. These agreements that I just mentioned between Telstra and Foxtel, between Telstra and MediaWorks, Stream, and Trade Me, these are but pygmies alongside a series of unregulated agreements that have been put in place between Sky and all of the major telecom ISPs in New Zealand, except Orcon, since 2009. Telecom, Telstra, Clear, Vodafone, Slingshot, and Whoosh. I'd say it's another example of the telecom ISPs in New Zealand moving as a flock, which, as I said, is a characteristic of what happens within concentrated markets. The dominant players move in flocks. Bandwidth caps are one instance, all right? And here, the kind of lining up one by one over an 18-month period with Sky is another, all right? The contracts themselves are confidential commercial documents, but given the stakes that are involved and the basics of sound regulation, I don't think they should be. While they likely have a few differences for each, I think from some journalistic accounts, when we know News Corp's practices in other countries, some leaks and a few educated guesses, we could come up with a list of common features, 6 of which I think stand out. Here's the 6 key things in this Sky Telecom agreement. The bandwidth caps, okay, of course. They're lifted for all Sky services. These would violate the Comcast rules in the US, without a doubt. In Canada, they would raise a political firestorm and the regulator's eyebrow, and everybody knows that regulation by raised eyebrow is sometimes an effective means of regulation. I'm not quite sure how things would fall out in Canada, though. I'd say it forms a kind of virtual integration. Basically, it ensures that Sky's programming is on every distribution platform and that telcos have content, which is entirely reasonable, right? Sky needs to be on every distribution platform. Telcos need to have content, all right? But the problem is that it hands the broadband plans and editorial control of the major telecom ISP players over to the delivery of Sky's pay TV services. What that means is the third point. Basically, the telecom ISPs are defanged as effective competitors in distribution and television markets, and we fortify Sky's stronghold over content rights markets because we take some of the major players that could be competing for rights out of those markets. All right? Fifth, packaging and presentation of Sky channels and services on telecom ISP networks likely in Sky's hands. Control of electronic programming guides would run afoul of the Comcast rules without a doubt. Finally, where are TVNZ, Maori TV, Radio NZ, campus and non-commercial media in all this? If we're developing an ultra-fast broadband system that's supposed to support and provide for all citizens of New Zealand, the fact that these significant players are, without a voice in any of this seems, to an outsider, strange. And my finishing slide here, my concluding thoughts. Thank you, David. So here's, after trying to figure out all this stuff, right, here's what I came up with. So your regulatory environment, as I said, I think has improved a lot. I don't think it's a problem so much with the regulator right now, but rather that it's not completely entrenched in its own convictions, but more importantly, within the institutional context of the TMI ecology. There's still this free market fantasy that the idea is that markets don't need regulation. The lesson of the last 20 years is that for markets to work, and especially in the communication, media, and entertainment works, there needs to be effective regulators. Full stop. That's why we've gone from 14 regulators in 1990 to 90 regulators in 1999 to 155 today. All right? The lesson is unequivocal on that point. Second thing, I was driven to madness trying to gather data here. This should not be the case. I'm a serious researcher. I know how to do research. I have colleagues in New Zealand who bitch and moan about the difficulty of getting access to data. This has to change. I mean, we can't have an open media environment in which the media purveyors themselves work by the double standard of, we give information to everybody else on our terms, but information about ourselves is not disclosed. This is a very strange situation. Third, media and internet use in New Zealand is strikingly low by global standards, and it's going to need to improve for the ultra-fast broadband to be viable. And that's not disconnected from fourth. Restricted bandwidth caps discourage internet use and a creative exploration of the possibilities of broadband media by the public, by small businesses, by artists, musicians, existing media players, non-commercial cultural media producers, the whole gamut. Even, who is it, Stephen Fry was sending tweets today, and he's, he's getting pissed off because he can't make Hobbit here or something like that. Did I get that right? This is serious. But in Canada, the cultural producers and the major organizations representing the television and film producers are raising the same point about bandwidth caps in Canada. Our bandwidth caps are 2 to 3 times as high as what your normal bandwidth caps are here. So if it's a problem in Canada, I can be sure that Stephen Fry, is serious in his point. All right. And this is the key problem right here. Fifth, the entrenched position of incumbents threatens the viability of the ultra-fast broadband, not just as an economic project, but one that speaks to the public and personal life in the digital age. All right? These are spaces in which we are increasingly living our lives online, and to have them regulated and throttled by bandwidth caps and high charges and so on cuts to the very texture of what it means to live a life online. It cuts to the texture of what it means to develop a network-free press in the 21st century. It cuts to the fabric of what it means to develop an open media system. And lastly, this is for the geeks out there. So basing universal fast broadband on the OSI, the 7-layer OSI model, is great. This is really wise, right? But right now, the OSI model and the openness between the layers is stuck down in a basement between layers 1 and 2. It's got to be driven up to layers 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And we're not going to be able to drive it up to layers 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 until we start paying attention to layer 8, money, power, and politics. Thanks a lot.